The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, casting everything below in that particular shade of white that made skin look like it belonged to a corpse. Laura Bennett moved through the ICU at St. Michael's in Norfolk with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned precision under fire, though no one here knew that. Her scrubs were navy blue, practical, unremarkable. The name badge clipped to her pocket read only Hel Bennett, RN. No rank. No decorations. No history. Just a nurse pushing a med cart at 6:08 a.m. on a Tuesday, her movements economical, each step deliberate, her hand steady as they checked vitals on the monitors lining the corridor. The ICU at St. Michael's was a fishbowl. Glass walls on every patient room, designed for visibility, for accountability, for the constant surveillance that modern medicine demanded. Laura understood visibility. She'd spent years in places where being visible meant being targeted. The rubber soles of her shoes whispered against the tile floor as she made rounds, checking fall lines, adjusting ventilator settings, reading the story that monitors told in their beeping rhythms. The smell of antiseptic mixed with something underneath it, the metallic edge of human suffering that no amount of cleaning solution could fully mask. Room for 08, stable. Room for 09, post-op, still sedated, breathing synchronously with the ventilator. Room for 10, cardiac rehab, improving. She moved with a kind of practiced grace that came from doing this 10,000 times, but there was something else in her movements too. Something that didn't quite fit in the civilian medical world. Her posture was too straight. Her awareness too complete. She noticed details that other nurses walked past. The slight wheezing in a patient's breath that might indicate fluid overload. The subtle pallor that suggested anemia. The tremor in a family member's hands that spoke to hidden fear. Pain was information. That principle had been beaten into her in a life she no longer officially lived. Dr. Marcus Pierce arrived at 7:13 a.m., moving through the ward with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his right to be anywhere. He was tall, expensively dressed even in his white coat, the fabric was too fine, the stitching too precise, and his watch caught the fluorescent light as he gestured toward the patient boards. His cologne preceded him into the unit, something woody and aggressive that seemed to announce his arrival before his voice did. The other nurses adjusted themselves around him, straightening, performing competence, the way staff did around anyone with institutional power. Dr. Pierce had that power in abundance. He'd been at St. Michael's for 6 years, had cultivated relationships with hospital board members through carefully orchestrated golf games, had positioned himself as indispensable through a combination of charm and strategic information control. What Dr. Pierce noticed about Laura Bennett in that first moment was not what he wanted to notice. He'd been observing her for 3 weeks, ever since the administrative reorganization that had placed her in the ICU full-time. Most nurses performed competence. Laura Bennett possessed it in a way that was almost unsettling. The way she moved through the ward suggested she was thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. The way her eyes tracked multiple monitors simultaneously, processing information faster than should be possible for someone without her eyes actually moving. The way she'd caught a medication error that Dr. Chen, not the colonel, the attending physician, had written without even being asked to verify it. She'd simply approached with a chart in hand and a neutral expression. "Dr. Chen, can you double-check this dose? I want to make sure the math is right." No accusation. No drama. Just efficiency. Just the kind of quiet competence that made people trust her immediately. Dr. Pierce did not trust her. Dr. Pierce trusted her far less than he should have. The reason was simple and financial and criminal. For the past 4 years, Dr. Pierce had been operating a billing scheme with Ascendant Medical Supply, a vendor that provided equipment to St. Michael's at approximately 400% above market rate. The equipment was real. The inflated codes were creative fiction. The insurance companies paid without question because the codes came from a hospital. The kickbacks appeared in Dr. Pierce's account as consulting fees for administrative work that had never been performed. $87,000 last year. $112,000 the year before. Enough to maintain the beach house in Outer Banks. Enough to explain the upgraded Range Rover. Enough to keep his ex-wife satisfied about spousal support. A nurse with Laura's level of competence would eventually notice the irregularities. Would ask questions. Would look at equipment invoices and wonder why a cardiac monitor cost $15,000 when she'd read the actual market price was $3,800. Would piece together the pattern the way people who understood systems always eventually did. And that was unacceptable. Dr. Pierce made a mental note as he watched her adjust a ventilator setting. Watch this one carefully. Room for 12 had been empty for 2 days. At 8:06 a.m., it received its new occupant. The transport team moved with practiced precision, transferring a patient from the gurney to the bed, the movement smooth and choreographed. Colonel Marcus Chen was 42 years old, Delta Force, currently in recovery from injuries sustained during a training operation that the medical record described only as blunt force trauma to the thoracic cavity, status post-stabilization. The record was, technically, truthful. It was simply missing approximately 80% of the relevant details. Military records often were. Laura was the first nurse assigned to Colonel Chen's care after the initial stabilization. She approached the bed with the same methodical attention she brought to every patient, checking the monitors, verifying the IV placement, reading the trauma surgeon's notes with the kind of focus that suggested she was seeing something beyond the written words. Muscle memory. That was what it was. Not conscious recognition. Not active recall. Just the way her body responded to the particular combination of thoracic injuries and strategic movement patterns that suggested high-level combat training gone wrong. "How are you feeling?" She asked it the way nurses asked, professionally neutral, her voice pitched low so it wouldn't disturb the other patient separated only by glass and air. Colonel Chen's eyes opened. He'd been sedated, but the sedation was beginning to wear off, and the first thing his eyes found was her face. The recognition happened in the space between one breath and the next. It was subtle, just the smallest shift in his pupils, the tiniest adjustment in his expression, but it was there. He'd seen this face before. Not in person. In photographs. In a young man's phone, pulled out during downtime between operations, showing her to the rest of the team. David Bennett's mother. David Bennett, who'd served under Colonel Chen's command for 3 years. David Bennett, who'd written to his mother after his first deployment in a letter that his commanding officer had helped him draft because the boy's hands were shaking too badly to hold a pen. David Bennett, whose commanding officer had promised to tell his mother that her son was courageous in ways that civilian life couldn't measure. "Good," Laura said, checking his oxygen saturation on the monitor. 94%. Strong. Your surgeon says you're healing well. You need rest and you need to stay still so nothing shifts internally. Can you do that? Yes, Colonel Chen said, and his voice was steady, which meant the pain was either manageable or he was practiced at not showing it. Probably both. Laura adjusted the flow rate on his IV, her movements precise, efficient. I'll check on you every 2 hours. If you need anything, there's a call button. She pointed to it, clipped to the bed rail. Use it. She turned to leave. That was the protocol. That was the boundary between patient care and privacy. But Colonel Chen's hand moved, not much, just a small shift on the blanket that caught her attention the way sudden movements always did, the way she'd been trained to notice threats and changes. "You have a son," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Laura's hand stilled on the medication cart. Her face didn't change. Her breathing didn't change. She simply stood very still for a moment, the way someone does when they've been surprised and are cataloging the implications of that surprise. "David," Colonel Chen continued, his voice soft enough that it wouldn't carry to the other rooms. 3rd Battalion, Charlie Company. Did 3 tours. He talks about you a lot. Laura inhaled slowly through her nose. She did not turn around. She did not change her expression. When she finally moved, it was to finish checking his full line, her hand steady, her attention absolute. "That's good," she said. "And then, rest. Your body needs it." She pushed the cart out of the room, her movements exactly the same as they'd been before, and yet something fundamental had shifted in the way she existed in that space. Something small. Something dangerous. Something that, if Dr. Pierce had been watching carefully enough, would have registered as a subtle change in the texture of her presence. But Dr. Pierce was making phone calls. He was standing in his office on the 4th floor, door closed, speaking in the kind of measured tones that suggested he was not merely making conversation but executing a plan. The hospital board members he was calling were men he'd cultivated carefully. Men who played golf. Men who understood the value of protecting one's interests. Men who understood that sometimes a nurse could become a problem before she actively became one. The fluorescent lights in the ICU continued their mechanical humming. The monitors continued their beeping. The glass walls continued their perfect visibility. And in room for 12, Colonel Marcus Chen closed his eyes and made a private calculation about timing, about consequences, about the particular weight of a promise made to a young soldier about his mother. Laura Bennett was back at the med station 5 minutes later, her hands moving through their practiced routines, pulling medications, verifying dosages, preparing for the afternoon shift. Nothing in her face suggested that anything had changed. Nothing in her bearing suggested that a single word had altered the careful balance she'd maintained for 8 years. She was still invisible. Still unremarkable. Still just a nurse. But invisibility, like any good cover, has a shelf life. Dr. Pierce found her at 7:22 a.m. in room for 18, standing beside Colonel Chen's bed reviewing his medication chart. The room was quiet except for the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze and the soft beeping of the cardiac monitor. Pierce entered with 2 families visiting a patient 3 doors down, enough witnesses to make his move. His voice carried that particular condescension reserved for people he'd already decided were beneath him. "Laura, might I have a word with the Hendersons?" He gestured toward the family gathered around the neighboring bed, his tone suggesting she'd somehow failed them already. She turned, chart still in her hands. Pierce continued, his smile sharp as a scalpel blade. "It seems we have a medication discrepancy. The evening shift documented that Mrs. Henderson should have received her antibiotic at 1800 hours, but the patient tells me she never received it. That's rather serious, don't you think? Especially for someone managing complex cases." Laura's eyes remained steady on his face. One measured breath. She did not argue. Did not defend. She simply said, "I'll check the dispensary logs." "That won't be necessary." Pierce's voice dropped lower, forcing the Hendersons to lean closer to catch his words. "The logs are clear. You signed off on the medication at 17:55. Either you didn't administer it, or you documented falsely. Which is it?" The wife's face tightened. The husband crossed his arms. Their daughter looked from Pierce to Laura with dawning suspicion. One tear escaped. Laura wiped it with the back of her hand without breaking his gaze. When she spoke, her voice emerged like steel wrapped in silk. "I've been dismissed by better men than you, Doctor, and I'm still here." She turned back to Colonel Chen's chart as if Pierce had already left the room. The family stared. Pierce's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected the response, not the quiet kind that didn't apologize or explain, but the kind that somehow made him look like the small one. He turned on his heel and left, but everyone in that room felt the shift. He'd swung and connected with nothing. By 9:15 a.m., a formal write-up appeared on the unit board in the break room. 3 paragraphs in Pierce's precise handwriting. Pattern of negligence. Failure to follow medication protocols. Insufficient attention to complex patient needs. Recommended for corrective action and further review. The paper was laminated. It would stay there for 14 days. Every nurse who came through that break room would read it. Every nurse would form an opinion. Laura sat at the small table that afternoon with her coffee cooling in front of her. The same table where, 2 days ago, Nurse Martinez had made her laugh about the attending physician who tried to order a CT scan on a patient already in the MRI. The same table where Patel had complained about his daughter's soccer team and asked if Laura wanted to come watch the weekend game. The same table where belonging had felt like a given. Now Patel came in around 2:40 p.m., saw her, and the expression on his face changed before his feet did. He gathered his lunch container without a word. Martinez followed, her eyes carefully fixed on the refrigerator. A third nurse, the one who'd borrowed Laura's trauma shears 3 days ago and said they were the best on the unit, simply turned and left without getting what she'd come for. Laura did not move. She did not speak. She sat with her coffee and watched the break room empty like air from a punctured lung. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their constant hum. Outside, rain had started, pattering against the small window. She could hear the 3:15 p.m. announcement of a routine code in the surgical wing, not an emergency, just a scheduled procedure. Ordinary hospital noise that continued whether she existed in it or not. That's when the overhead speaker crackled with the words that would change the entire trajectory of her careful, hidden life. Code Blue, ICU room for 12. I repeat, Code Blue, ICU for 12. Room for 12 was Colonel Chen. Laura was moving before she consciously decided to move. The break room door swung inward. Her shoes, black, practical, worn in a way that suggested they'd walked more distance than ordinary ICU shifts allowed, hit the tile with purpose. The hallway stretched ahead like a corridor she'd traveled 1,000 times in a different life, under different stars, in a place where movement meant survival and hesitation meant death. She could hear boots already. Multiple sets. Residents and the senior attending. The crash cart was being wheeled. She reached the room as they were transferring Chen to the monitor, his chest rigid, his neck twisted at an angle that meant only one thing: tension pneumothorax. His oxygen saturation was dropping. 67, 61. The attending fumbled with an oxygen mask. The resident reached for a chest tube kit with hands that shook slightly. The fluorescent lights above the bed seemed impossibly bright. Antiseptic. Stainless steel. And underneath it all, for just a moment, the smell shifted. Copper. Dust. The particular iron-blooded desert smell of the trauma tent at FOB Shank, where she'd stood in full tactical gear deciding whose wound to address first when all of them were bleeding out. The distant percussion of mortar fire became the monitor alarm. Sand became sweat. The tent's fabric became these walls. 73 days. 3 mass casualties in one afternoon. 142 wounded. 17 gone before she could do anything but hold their hands and whisper names so they weren't alone. She could see the dry riverbed where the IED had detonated. The screams. The way Chen's deputy had looked at her after, not with fear, but with the kind of recognition that comes when you watch someone make impossible choices under fire and they choose right every time. She blinked. The desert was gone. The ICU remained. Chen's eyes were open, and they were looking directly at her. His lips were moving, trying to form words against the oxygen mask. The attending wasn't listening. The resident was still fumbling. 30 seconds until cardiac arrest at this saturation level. Pain was data. 30 seconds was an eternity. Laura moved. Her hand was already reaching. 14-gauge angiocath needle. She didn't ask permission. Didn't explain. The attending turned to tell her she wasn't the one handling this, but something in the way she'd moved, the way her entire body had shifted into something that wasn't hesitation or deference, made him pause instead. She located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. 3 years of Norfolk ICU work. 14 years before that of something else. Something that had taught her this gesture so thoroughly it lived in her muscles now. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping made everyone in the room stop breathing. His oxygen saturation climbed. 71, 78. 85, the resident's mouth opened. The attending's expression shifted from annoyance to something closer to awe. Chen's deputy, standing in the doorway, because she'd arrived within 90 seconds of the code announcement, because she'd been waiting for something, waiting for someone, looked at Laura with eyes that suddenly held everything. And Chen, his saturation now climbing past 88, his chest expanding properly, his crisis arrested, whispered one word through the oxygen mask. Artemis. The room went dead silent. The silence stretched across the ICU like a held breath. 3 seconds. 4. Then Colonel Chen's chest seized. His body went rigid, a marionette with cut strings, and the monitors erupted into a symphony of alarms that made every head in the unit snap toward room for 12. His oxygen saturation plummeted like a stone through dark water. 88, 82. 76, falling. Dr. Vance, the attending physician, was already moving through the doorway when Chen's trachea shifted visibly beneath the skin of his neck, an anatomical betrayal that meant only one thing. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung pressing against his heart, suffocating him from the inside out. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, pushing air into a space that had nowhere left to go. Pressure building. Pressure killing. Vance froze. His hands hovered over Chen's chest like he was trying to remember a prayer he'd learned 30 years ago and forgotten in the living. The man had been a trauma surgeon once, before administration had lured him into the administrative warm and away from the sharp edge of real emergency medicine. His face had gone the color of old institutional tile. "Get me a crash cart," he said. His voice trembled. "Someone get." Laura was already moving. She didn't run. She didn't shout. Her hands moved like they'd been waiting for this exact moment for 8 years, muscle memory taking over from a brain that knew better than to think. The world narrowed. Everything else, the write-up on the unit board, the nurses who wouldn't sit with her at lunch, the weight of Pierce's contempt, all of it disappeared into a pinpoint of focus. She was in room for 12 in 4 strides. The monitors screamed. O2 sat 71. Heart rate 156. Blood pressure cratering. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart without breaking stride, her fingers moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this in the dark, in the rain, in a compound in Ramadi where the screaming never stopped and the only currency was precision under pressure. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she said, not to anyone in particular but to the muscle memory that had kept her alive through things she couldn't speak about and couldn't forget. Her voice had changed. Dropped an octave. The timid nurse who apologized for existing was gone. Vance stepped back. He didn't argue. Something in her posture, in the absolute authority of her movements, had shifted the entire gravitational center of the room. She swabbed the site with iodine. One movement, economical. She didn't hesitate. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle through the intercostal space, through skin and muscle and pleura, and then the hiss of air escaping. Pressure releasing. A sound like a tire deflating in slow motion, like the world exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The entire ICU heard it. Through the glass walls that made the unit a fishbowl of competence and crisis, every staff member paused. Every monitor in the place seemed to listen. O2 sat began climbing. 73, the monitors still screamed but differently now. Less panic. More recovery. 79, 84. Laura didn't move the needle. She waited. Breathing steady as a metronome. A presence in the room that made the air pressure change, that turned her from a bullied nurse into something else entirely. Something that made grown doctors remember why they'd been afraid of real emergency medicine in the first place. 88, 91. 94, stable. Chen's chest rose and fell, the ventilator no longer fighting a losing battle. His color shifted from the gray of dying to the pink of returning. Sinus rhythm. The tachycardia began to slow. His blood pressure climbed back from the precipice. She'd won. In 40 seconds, she'd done what a surgeon couldn't do. And nobody moved. Laura withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd inserted it. She placed it on the sterile field without a sound. Her hands were steady. Hands that had held lives together in places where the infrastructure of civilization had collapsed. Hands that had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury, that fear was information, and information was what kept you alive. Through the glass walls of the unit, she could see them. The respiratory therapist with her mouth open. The nursing assistant frozen mid-gesture. Two other nurses who had walked past her without acknowledgement in the break room now staring like they were trying to solve a puzzle that didn't have any words. And at the back of the room, partially obscured by the doorframe, Dr. Pierce. His face had gone white. Not the white of shock or relief. The white of a man watching something he'd orchestrated begin to collapse. A nurse with this level of emergency medical knowledge, this level of field trauma expertise, she would notice things eventually. She would see the phantom equipment charges, the inflated billing codes, the vendor relationships that didn't add up. She would become a problem he couldn't simply humiliate into submission. She could feel his stare like a physical weight. She didn't look at him. Instead, she turned to Vance, whose hands were still shaking slightly, and said something that made three staff members lean against the wall in what might have been relief or might have been the sudden awareness that they'd just witnessed something that didn't fit into any of their preconceived notions about the nurse they'd pitted just an hour ago. His stable. Chest tube protocol, 28 French. I'll help you with the placement if you want backup. It wasn't a request. It was a command from someone who'd said it 1,000 times, in a language that only people who'd lived on the edge of violence truly understood. Vance nodded. He didn't speak. He just nodded and moved into the room like a man reprieved from execution. Laura stepped back, and for just a moment, something visible rippled across her jaw. Not fear. Not doubt. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. 8 years of hiding compressed into a single moment of muscle control, the effort required to keep her body from remembering that it was built for command, for authority, for the kind of decisiveness that came from a life where hesitation meant someone died. She caught her reflection in the glass partition. For just a second, she didn't recognize herself. The woman looking back had eyes like someone who'd seen too much and survived anyway. Eyes that had directed field triage operations across 700 meters of open combat, deciding who lived and who received comfort care in the moments before mortality took them. In her pocket, the faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining seemed to pulse with a weight it hadn't carried since the day a Pentagon liaison had ordered her to disappear. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't what Pierce had just realized as he backed away from the doorway and pulled out his phone with fingers that suddenly moved with the urgency of a man running out of time. He was already making the first call. To someone on the hospital board. Someone who owed him a favor. Someone who understood that a nurse with her skill set was only manageable if she was either controlled or removed. The alarms in room for 12 had silenced into routine monitoring sounds. Chen's vitals climbed steadily back into the land of the living. And as Laura turned back toward the supply room to document her actions, every person in the ICU understood with sudden clarity that they had just watched a woman save a man's life, and in doing so, confirmed that she was exactly the kind of threat that people like Pierce had been trained, their entire professional lives, to eliminate. By end of shift, Dr. Pierce sat in his office with the door closed and made the calls that would destroy her. First to Harold Blackwell, chief of surgery, a man Pierce had steered toward a Cayman Islands account stuffed with $340,000 in kickback proceeds. Harold, we have a competency problem on the ICU. A nurse overstepped protocol this morning. Endangered a patient. Blackwell listened. Blackwell always listened when money was involved. Next came Linda Vasquez from HR, then a call to the private investigator Pierce kept on retainer, a man named Garrett who specialized in building cases against employees who became liabilities. Garrett had done this work before. He knew how to manufacture documentation, how to contact previous employers and plant suggestions, how to craft a narrative that would hold up in a termination hearing but would never survive actual scrutiny. The problem was that scrutiny wouldn't happen. Not with the board members Pierce had cultivated over 9 years of golf outings, charity galas, and carefully distributed pharmaceutical rep bonuses. By 4:48 p.m., Pierce had activated a network that extended beyond the hospital walls like roots searching for what it needed to destroy. The investigator was already drafting a report that cited unsubstantiated claims of medication errors, conflicts with attending physicians, and a pattern of behavior that suggested Laura lacked the judgment required for critical care nursing. None of it was true. All of it was meticulously documented. By 5:13 p.m., Two security officers in pressed uniforms appeared at the ICU nursing station with Laura's personnel file in hand. One of them, a woman with kind eyes that didn't match the task, held out her hand for Laura's badge. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Laura unpinned the ID from her scrubs and placed it on the woman's palm without a word. The badge was warm from her body. She watched it disappear into the woman's pocket and felt something anchor inside her chest, a familiar sensation, one she'd learned to recognize years ago in Ramadi when orders came down and she had to vanish into a different identity. Except this time there was no mission waiting. There was no team. There was only the walk to her locker in the changing room, her hand steady as she cleared out 8 months of accumulated belongings. A photograph of David in his dress uniform. A half-empty bottle of lotion. The uniform she'd never worn, her dress blues, folded in a plastic dry-cleaning bag, hidden beneath the ordinary things. The faded unit patch was inside the jacket lining, where she'd sewn it herself with a needle and thread from the hospital supply cabinet. She'd kept one artifact of who she'd been, hidden where no one would find it. She removed her scrub cap. She cleared her locker. She walked past colleagues who suddenly found their shoes very interesting. The drive home was quiet. The rain started somewhere around the Commercial Boulevard exit, the kind of Norfolk rain that came in sheets without warning, the kind that made the road slick and the streetlights blur into halos. By the time she pulled into her driveway, her uniform was damp and her hands were shaking. Not from cold. From restraint. Laura sat at the kitchen table still wearing her scrubs, still wearing the smell of the hospital, antiseptic and human sweat and the particular exhaustion of a shift that had ended with her being erased. The rain hammered against the window. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the dark and let the tears come silently, the way soldiers do. Not the wrenching sobs of civilian grief, but the quiet leaking of something too heavy to carry alone anymore. Her hands rested on the table, palms up, and she stared at them as if they belonged to someone else. Hands that had held lives together in Ramadi. Hands that had performed an emergency decompression today without hesitation. Hands that had just lost everything because they were too good at what they'd been trained to do. She thought about calling the union rep, she thought about defending herself, explaining that she'd followed protocol, that Colonel Chen would corroborate everything. But she couldn't. The moment she defended herself, she'd have to explain where she'd learned emergency procedures that exceeded a civilian nurse's standard training. She'd have to answer questions about her background. She'd have to surface. And the military had been very clear about what happened if she surfaced: the classified mission in Ramadi, the 3 soldiers she'd saved under fire, the operation that had gone sideways in ways that were still redacted. All of it would become a problem for people much more powerful than Dr. Pierce. So she sat in the dark and accepted the erasure because acceptance was the only way to stay invisible. The tears came hotter now, and she let them, knowing no one was watching. No one was keeping score. No one cared that she'd been ordered to disappear into civilian life and had done it for 8 years without complaint. The door opened. Small feet moved across the tile floor. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in his elementary school uniform, still carrying his backpack, and his face crumpled when he saw his mother at the table with tears on her cheeks. He was 7. He didn't understand yet. He probably thought someone had died. "Mommy." His voice was very small. "Why are you home? It's still daytime. People need you." Laura closed her eyes. Her son moved toward her with the particular care of a child who sensed something broken in the adult he loved. He didn't know that his mother was Captain Laura Bennett, callsign Artemis, Delta Force, 3 silver stars buried in a file that officially didn't exist. He didn't know that the man in room for 12 was his father's commanding officer, or that his mother had saved that officer's life and sacrificed everything in return. He only knew that his mother was home when she wasn't supposed to be, and that made the world feel wrong. "The hospital let me have the day off, sweetheart." The lie felt like rust in her mouth. David climbed into her lap, something he'd been too old for lately, and wrapped his arms around her neck. His backpack pressed against her spine. He smelled like school cafeteria and crayons and something essential that was purely him. Are you okay? His voice was muffled against her shoulder. Laura held him and felt the weight of every choice she'd made stacking on top of her like armor, or like chains. She'd chosen to disappear. She'd chosen to protect him by keeping him safe from her past. She'd chosen invisibility because visible women with her skill set became targets. And now she was paying the price for that choice with a child who didn't understand why the person he loved most was crying in the dark at 4 in the afternoon. She kissed the top of his head and said nothing, because there was nothing true she could tell him. She simply held him and let him hold her, and outside the rain turned heavier, and somewhere in the distance, a sound began to rise, a sound so distant it was barely audible at first, a rhythmic beating that grew louder with each second, the unmistakable percussion of rotor blades cutting through the evening sky. The helicopter blades cut through the rain like a razor through silk. David's small body went rigid against her chest as the sound grew louder, closer, shaking the kitchen windows in their frames. Laura didn't move. She couldn't. The rhythmic percussion of those rotors meant only one thing: military transport, and that meant someone had talked. Someone had broken her silence, and now the world she'd spent 8 years hiding from was landing in her backyard. The Black Hawk descended through the clouds at 11:24 p.m. Searchlights swept across the modest 3-bedroom colonial on Briggs Avenue, illuminating rain-slicked grass and a mailbox with her civilian name painted in fading blue letters. Laura set David down on the couch, whispered "Stay here" with a voice that made him obey without question, and walked to the door just as a knock came, not urgent, not threatening, but the measured knock of someone who knew she wouldn't run. A Marine captain in dress blue stood on the porch, rain dripping from his cover. Behind him, 2 more in full combat gear secured the perimeter with the casual precision of men who'd done this 100 times. The captain's eyes held recognition and something else: respect. "Captain Bennett. Colonel Chen's been asking for you. Says he needs Artemis." The Marine paused. "Says it's time." The word hung in the rain-soaked air between them. Artemis. Her call sign. The ghost she'd buried 7 years ago when a classified operation in Ramadi went catastrophically wrong and the Pentagon decided her entire service record should cease to exist. Officially, Captain Laura Bennett had never been to Iraq. She'd never directed trauma operations under fire. She'd never held the lives of 18 men in her hands while IED shrapnel fell like hail around her surgical tent. That woman had been erased. Deleted. Buried so deep in black site files that even her own personnel records had been redacted. The administrator's confused voice echoed in her memory: "The patient keeps asking for someone called Artemis. Keeps saying Artemis saved him. Do you know what he's talking about?" She'd said no. She'd lied perfectly, the way the military had trained her to lie. Compartmentalize. Survive. Disappear. But Colonel Chen remembered. 30 minutes later, Laura stood outside the St. Michael's ICU in dress blues for the first time in 8 years. The uniform felt like a second skin she'd forgotten she was wearing. The weight of it, the authority, the history, the scars of a life she'd supposedly left behind, pressed against her shoulders as she walked through the doors. Medical staff froze. The same nurses who'd shunned her yesterday suddenly couldn't look away. Recognition flickered across faces. Not of the nurse they dismissed, but of something else entirely. Chen's deputy was already in the briefing room, a serious-faced major with a file marked classified in red letters. Dr. Pierce stood near the window, arms crossed, wearing that expression of practiced authority that masked pure arrogance. The administrator sat nervously, fingers drumming on the table. When Laura entered, the major came to attention. "Captain Bennett." Not a greeting. A statement of fact. "Colonel Chen has regained consciousness and requested you by your call sign." The hospital staff didn't understand the reference. They do now. The major opened the file. Her file. 7-year-old photographs of Captain Laura Bennett in desert fatigues, face streaked with blood and dust, standing over a field surgical setup that had been constructed in a warehouse in Jolan district. The words blurred as the major's voice cut through: Ramadi. September 2016. Mass casualty event following an IED detonation at a checkpoint. Captain Bennett was attached to 1st SFOD Delta Task Force as Senior Trauma Surgeon's Assistant. She performed emergency procedures on 17 wounded personnel in 12 hours under sustained enemy fire with zero supplies beyond what she improvised from warehouse materials. The Major paused. Each beat carried weight. Bronze Star for Valor under fire. The Major held the photograph up. Laura's face was unreadable in it. Silver Star for coordination of casualty evacuation under enemy engagement. Another pause. Laura's jaw didn't move. Second Silver Star for preventing catastrophic blood loss on 3 separate occasions using field expedient methods that defied standard protocol but saved lives. The Major's voice grew quieter. And a nomination for the Distinguished Service Cross that was classified because the operation itself was buried so deep that officially, Captain Bennett, you were never in Ramadi. Dr. Pierce's face had gone the color of old ashes. This is fabricated. Personnel files. False credentials. She's a nurse. She's. The door opened. A 2-star general walked in, dress uniform so crisp it looked like it had been cut from armor plate. He was flanked by 2 Air Force officers in Class A's. Without a word, without breaking stride, he came directly to Laura. His eyes locked onto hers with a kind of intensity that made the air pressure change. His hand came up in a sharp salute, the kind reserved for military decorations, not people. His arm remained at attention as his eyes flicked to the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining of her jacket where she'd kept it hidden since the day she was told to disappear. That patch was from the 75th Ranger Regiment. It was the only piece of her past she'd allowed herself to keep. Pierce's voice cracked. This doesn't prove anything. She could have stolen. Dr. Pierce. The general's voice was like a tank engine idling in a parking garage. Pressure. Threat. Absolute authority. I suggest you sit down and stop talking. A woman in a dark suit stepped forward next to the general. Federal bearing. Every movement efficient. She opened her jacket far enough to show the small gold badge clipped to her belt. Pentagon liaison. The room contracted around her presence. Dr. Edward Pierce, she said, not a question. You are under investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Defense for fraudulent medical billing, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, kickback schemes worth approximately $847,000 over 18 months, and most critically, your attempts to forge personnel records and fabricate disciplinary documentation on a federal asset currently activated for a joint FBI operation. She set a folder on the table. Captain Bennett has been activated as Artemis for investigations into medical fraud at military-adjacent facilities. Your calls to board members have been recorded. Your contact with external investigators has been documented. Your electronic communications requesting false evidence against this officer have triggered federal alerts. Pierce stood so fast his chair clattered backward. This is insane. I'm calling my attorney. You'll do that from federal custody, the liaison said flatly. FBI agents are currently securing your office. We have your laptop, your phone, your financial records, and most importantly, the communication logs showing exactly how you attempted to destroy a decorated officer to protect a criminal enterprise. The room went so quiet you could hear the ventilator hissing in Chen's room 3 doors down the hallway. 14 minutes later, federal agents escorted Dr. Pierce from the building in handcuffs. His face was the color of raw chicken. He'd stammered excuses for the first 90 seconds, then gone completely silent, the way people do when they understand their entire life has just ended. Laura watched from the ICU window as they walked him past the break room where the nurses had shunned her, past the supply closet where she'd steadied herself before rounds, past the unit board where his written condemnation still hung like accusations. The nurses watched in complete silence. Some of them began to nod. 6 months later, St. Michael's held a ceremony Laura never anticipated. The hospital board announced a new Veterans in Healthcare initiative, $3 million allocated over 5 years to support medical professionals with military backgrounds. A permanent VA wing was being constructed on the east side. scholarships for military dependents looking to enter nursing and medicine. And Colonel Marcus Chen, cleared for discharge, stood at attention in his Class A uniform to personally recommend that the ICU be renamed the Bennett Chen Trauma Unit. Laura stood in her dress uniform at the hospital steps, the morning sun catching the 3 silver stars on her chest. No longer hidden. No longer erased. The uniform fitted her differently now, not as a costume, not as a disguise, but as what she'd always been. A captain. A warrior. A medic who'd learned that saving lives under fire was the simplest job she'd ever done compared to hiding who she was. The coroner's van pulled up and made the turn toward the parking garage where Dr. Pierce had once arrived in a Mercedes. Not Pierce himself. His replacement. But the moment carried weight anyway. A sedan pulled into the lot moments later. Pierce had made a deal with the federal prosecutors, cooperation in exchange for reduced sentencing. 10 months in a minimum security facility, followed by 5 years of supervised release. And a job, assigned by the court as part of his restitution, driving a medical supply van for the company whose equipment he'd fraudulently billed to insurance companies. The same supplies he'd once inflated the price on by 340%. He climbed out of the van's passenger side, wearing a polo shirt with a company logo and a name tag that read Pete instead of Doctor. A federal monitor watched him from the driver's seat. Pierce's hands trembled as he unloaded boxes of orthopedic braces and wound care kits. Not the shaking of weakness. The shaking of a man who'd discovered that karma wasn't metaphorical, it was logistical. His eyes found Laura standing on the hospital steps in full dress blues. Recognition hit him like a physical force. The woman he'd tried to destroy. The woman he'd called overwhelmed and negligent and beneath his contempt. The woman whose credentials had been classified so thoroughly that he'd assumed they were fiction. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge him. She simply watched as he flinched, as the shame washed across his face in real time, as he realized that every nurse in that hospital now knew exactly who he'd tried to destroy and exactly what she actually was. David stood beside her in his Marine Class A's, both of them saluting as Colonel Chen's transport pulled up to the main entrance. 2 warriors honoring another. The sun caught those 3 silver stars again, turning them to molten light. Laura had spent 8 years choosing obscurity. Choosing the quiet work of saving lives without recognition. Choosing the grind of the night shift and the ache in her feet and the weight of maintaining a lie every single day. She'd told herself she was protecting her son. Protecting the secret. Protecting the mission she'd been ordered to bury. But watching Pierce drive away in that van, knowing that federal agents had turned his fraud network inside out, knowing that her real service record was being read into the congressional record by senators who wanted to know how many other decorated veterans had been ordered to erase themselves, Laura understood something she'd been running from. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. She'd saved lives in the dark. She'd healed the broken without claiming credit. She'd held her son's hand while lying to him about who she was, because the military had ordered her to disappear. And in that disappearance, in that humility, in that quiet dignity under constant pressure, she'd become something rarer than any rank. She'd become a human being. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, 8 years of it finally releasing. But she didn't cry. She simply took her son's hand and walked back into the hospital, back to work, still in scrubs, still just a nurse. Except now the entire institution understood what just a nurse really meant. Subscribe, like, and comment if you believe the quiet ones are the most dangerous. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real story?